I lived with my mom and two younger brothers. Being the oldest among us, my mom relied on me to handle things, which made me assume adult responsibilities from a very young age. To this day, my mom expresses guilt about thrusting adulthood upon me so early, as she believes it deprived me of a proper childhood. Perhaps she is right. It's worth mentioning that my dad was largely absent from our lives. He was an abusive alcoholic, and when I say abusive, I mean it was severe. Until I turned 10, he lived with us, and whenever he was drunk, he would subject us to horrifying physical abuse. It was a constant state of terror. The only relief came during the periods when he didn't have alcohol, or when he went without drinking for months. During those times, he appeared to be a decent person. Despite his flaws, he could have been an exemplary human being if not for his rampant alcoholism and the darkness that consumed him when he was intoxicated. The incident that finally led my mom to divorce him was truly horrendous. I recall being in my room, engrossed in playing video games or something similar, while he was in the living room. My mom had just returned from grocery shopping, and he baselessly accused her of having an affair. He adamantly believed it, screaming at her while pinning her down on the floor. He claimed he saw her nose growing and then grabbed a screwdriver, cutting into my mom's nose, leaving a permanent scar. This incident took place when I was around 10 years old. Fast forward about 5 years. My mom was accompanying my two younger brothers on a Boy Scout trip. They always felt left out because all the other kids had fathers actively involved in their lives. My mom's guilt compelled her to volunteer and assist whenever possible. So, she went with my brothers on a weekend camping trip with the Boy Scouts. She genuinely wanted me to go with them, as she felt uneasy leaving me alone in the house. However, I insisted that I was mature enough to handle it, and truthfully, I didn't even have friends to party with if I wanted to. Eventually, she relented and allowed me to stay at home alone. I remember being in my bedroom, playing on my PlayStation, during a typical Saturday afternoon. Then, I heard a car pull up outside. Initially, I didn't know who it was, but a wave of panic washed over me, fearing that I might have to call the police. Since my bedroom window didn't provide a clear view of the driveway, it took me a moment. However, after examining the visible portion of the car, I recognized it as my father's vehicle. I was immediately mortified, as our relationship was strained, and my mom had taken legal action by obtaining a restraining order against him after their separation. Nervous and unsure of what to do, I cracked open my window so I could hear what was happening outside. I hoped that by listening, I could gain some understanding. To my surprise, I heard my father crying. His weeping sounded intense, and I hadn't heard from him in years. My mom had assured us that we would never see him again, yet here he was, crying in our driveway. He paced around for a few more minutes, before finally standing still. His crying grew louder, and then he screamed, "Pop!" Immediately following that scream, I heard a gunshot. At that moment, I knew exactly what had happened. Despite knowing the tragic truth, I rushed outside. I looked down at my father's lifeless body on the driveway, blood staining the pavement. As traumatic as it may sound, I didn't shed a tear or display any emotional response. I simply called the police. Within a few minutes, the police arrived and took me into their custody. Their objective was to ensure my safety until they could reach my mom. The subsequent events unfolded as one would expect. My mom apologized profusely, and I had to answer some routine questions for the police. There was nothing extraordinary about the interrogation. Reflecting on the situation, I'm unsure how to process it. I lack sympathy for my father, and part of me finds some relief that he took his own life. However, looking back, I wish it could have happened in a way that spared me from witnessing it. The entire experience instilled in me an aversion to staying home alone. Even after a considerable amount of time has passed since that incident, I go to great lengths to avoid being alone at home. If the situation arises, I make an effort to leave the house or invite a friend over. I simply won't stay there alone. A couple of years have passed since that dark chapter, and I can't help but feel that it ultimately had a positive outcome. My father was a truly destructive person, and while it may sound harsh, I sometimes wish he had taken his own life much earlier. For those fortunate enough not to have experienced a toxic and negative parental figure, consider yourselves extremely lucky. The tribulations I endured at the hands of my father fueled an immense amount of anger within me. After recently completing my college education, as a marketing major, I faced challenges in securing a job. Unlike some of my peers, who had job prospects lined up immediately after graduation, I found myself in a situation where I had to move back in with my parents. Returning to my childhood home, after being away for so long, felt strange, especially since it was just me and my dog before. And now I was living with my mom and dad again. It was not an ideal situation. Something I don't usually talk about openly is that, when I was younger, I had a unique intuition or ability to communicate with or at least perceive ghosts. As a child, I would often have conversations with invisible entities and claim to be interacting with spirits. I couldn't explain why I possessed this ability, but I knew it was real. I distinctly remember feeling their presence and establishing a connection before being able to communicate. Even now, I still possess this ability, although it has become more challenging to tap into. Towards the end of my college years, I became increasingly interested in exploring this phenomenon. I spent countless nights meditating and attempting to connect with the spirits around me. Now here's the situation. During my time in college, my parents had moved to a new house. However, I never felt a strong attachment to their new home and didn't particularly enjoy spending time there. Even during summers, I preferred staying at my city apartment. So, you can understand why it was unsettling for me and my dog, Dorian, to move back into a house that I had never truly lived in. Although the move itself wasn't negative, anyone who values their sense of familiarity and frequently changes residences can attest to the inherent unease it can bring, regardless of how secure one may be in other aspects of their life. One Friday night, my parents went out for dinner, seeking a break from their daily worries. Meanwhile, my two younger brothers, who were both in high school, spent the night at a friend's place, engaging in their usual routine of gaming and sleepovers. This left me and Dorian alone at home until my parents' return, which was likely to be quite late. I vividly recall feeling an inexplicable sense of unease, as if something was amiss. It's challenging to articulate, but the atmosphere felt off. I was in my room, engrossed in reading an article about job hunting strategies at around 9 o'clock in the evening. My parents wouldn't be back until 11 or 12. Suddenly, I heard an unusual noise from Dorian, a mix between a bark and a whimper. I immediately sensed that something was wrong, because he rarely made such sounds. Hastily, I rushed downstairs to investigate. To my surprise, Dorian appeared perfectly fine, as if nothing had happened. This struck me as highly abnormal. I frantically searched the house, looking for any signs of trouble, but everything seemed to be in order. I attributed Dorian's behavior to his discomfort in my parents' house, which seemed like a reasonable explanation at the time. Returning upstairs, intending to resume my job search, I heard that same strange noise again, about 15 minutes later. This time, it deeply unsettled me. It was entirely out of character for Dorian, and an impending sense of doom washed over me. Urgently, I raced downstairs, scanning the surroundings. Dorian was nowhere to be found. I called out to him, but received no response. Then, I made the devastating discovery. I found my beloved dog lifeless on the floor. It was perplexing, because he was only 2 or 3 years old. I carefully examined his body, but there were no signs of a struggle, no blood, bruises, or puncture wounds. I felt an overwhelming sadness, but the fear and adrenaline coursing through me never subsided. I waited anxiously for my parents to return, unsure of what else to do. I hesitated to involve the police, deeming it too extreme. And I didn't want to be the recent college graduate who had moved back in with their parents for a week, only to summon them home due to fear. This incident occurred some time ago, and I still can't explain the circumstances surrounding my dog's death. Fortunately, I managed to secure a job a few days later in a nearby city, which allowed me to move out of that unsettling house. It greatly disturbed me, and after such an experience, I made it clear to my parents that they are welcome to visit me, but I would rather not return to their house. This incident occurred a while back when I was home alone, with only my dog. Even now, I'm unsure about what exactly happened. It was a peculiar and unsettling experience, and I couldn't discern the man's true intentions. It was around 11 p.m, and I was watching TV when I heard a car pull up outside. The engine turned off, and I assumed it was a neighbor. However, my curious dog went to the window, causing the blinds to get disarranged. I got up to fix them and noticed a car parked across the street from my house and my neighbor's house. Although I couldn't see any details clearly, it appeared that the driver remained in the car. Initially, I didn't think much of it, so I got a drink and returned to watching TV. Some time had passed, approximately 15 to 20 minutes after fixing the blinds, when I suddenly thought I heard tapping at the door. It wasn't a typical knock, rather, it was a faint and light tapping sound. My dog sat up, looking towards the door, and I paused the TV. Soon after, the tapping began on the window. Curiosity got the better of me, and I cautiously opened the blinds a little. That's when I saw a man standing there. I couldn't make out his face clearly, and he immediately walked back to the door, tapping on it again. While this may not sound particularly alarming, for some reason, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. I felt an intense and unexplainable terror. Something in my gut told me that if I were to open the door, something terrible would happen. To gather more information, I went upstairs and opened a window to speak to the man from a safer distance. He spoke in a soft voice, claiming to be a pizza delivery person and mentioning the amount I owed. Feeling foolish for being frightened, I informed him that I hadn't ordered any pizza. I assumed he was speaking quietly and tapping lightly to avoid disturbing my neighbors. My dog followed me upstairs and intermittently growled and barked, which wasn't entirely unusual for him. While trying to calm him down, the man downstairs became increasingly insistent, telling me that he had the correct address and demanding that I come downstairs immediately to pay for the order and collect my food before it got cold. I was perplexed because I hadn't ordered any food, and I reiterated this to him. Strangely, I noticed that he wasn't carrying a pizza or any other item. Despite my repeated explanations that he had the wrong address, the man grew angrier. He oscillated between anger and attempts to persuade me to go back downstairs. I asked him where the pizza was, and he claimed to have it in his possession. It was dark outside, but I could clearly see that he had nothing in his hands. At this point, my dog's commotion had attracted the attention of my neighbor, who opened his front door. The man didn't utter a word, but practically sprinted across the street to the car that had arrived earlier. He got into the car empty-handed. I have no clue about his true intentions, but he certainly wasn't a delivery driver. It greatly disturbed me, especially considering that my dog is a large breed, and the man had seen him through the window. The fact that he wasn't deterred by my dog's presence adds another layer of oddity to the situation. It seems even more perplexing and less coincidental that he specifically drove to my house, as if he had planned to show up.